So how much of a negative influence can media have? Is this a valid concern, or is excuse me, is this just a bunch of concerned parents causing a fuss about pretty much nothing? We're so used to parents and others being concerned about the internet and how unhealthy it can be for young people, and being concerned about violent video games, and being concerned about what kids see on TV. And we often forget that these concerns existed long before the internet was invented. For years and years and years, research about the media and the effect of media on kids focused on TV, specifically violence on TV, and more specifically, the effect of violent TV on young children, which is not our focus. But if you take the Child and Society course, we'll talk about it in that course. What about for adolescents, kids who are a bit older? Does watching violent TV make them, or at least encourage them, to be aggressive in real life? Now, yes, there's been research in this area, and it's very similar to the Bobo doll experiments discussed earlier. You'll have a group of adolescents divided into two, or actually into three, so you have a control group. One half watch something on TV that's violent or aggressive, and the other half don't. And then the researchers observe how the adolescents behave and compare the results of these observations between groups. And for adolescents, the results of these studies is pretty weak. It's pretty inconclusive. They cannot state with certainty that violent TV has a negative effect. Now, your text talks specifically about research conducted by doctors Aron and Huzman. And what's neat about their research is that it was longitudinal in nature, meaning it occurred over a period of time, not all at once. So the report was called Television and the Aggressive Child, a cross-national comparison. It was first published in 1986. Huge sample size. They had about 800 8-year-old kids. And what they did was they looked at their TV viewing habits, kept track of them. And they had their teachers provide reports of their behavior at school and their parents and that sort of thing. And then they followed them over time until the 8-year-olds were 30 years old. Not checking in with them every day or every month or even every year, but periodically at predetermined times. So began when the kids were 8, checked in with them again at age 19, and checked in with them again at age 30. And the results were interesting because they found that yes, there is a correlation between watching violent TV as a child and an increase in aggressiveness in their subjects as they get older, which does apply to this course. They said that watching TV classified as violent when 8 was an accurate predictor of aggressive behavior when the subjects were 19. And when they were 30, these same subjects were more likely to have had traffic violations, they were more likely to have been arrested, and they were more likely to abuse their own children. So, watching violent and aggressive TV at a younger age meant they were more likely to be aggressive at a later age compared to 8-year-olds who didn't watch that kind of TV. So note that this supports social learning theory, that watching somebody will have an influence on you, that you learn from observing them. And just as a side note, this is interesting, that this was only true of the male subjects, not the female subjects. That's something I would definitely want to investigate further. I also found the other studies cited in the text really interesting because of the circumstances surrounding it. Even though the age of the subjects, again, is slightly off, since they were in middle childhood and not adolescents, but it's still very interesting. And this takes place in Canada. If you have a community of kids and the community has no TV at all, but then TV is introduced, how is that going to affect the kids in that community? And of course, this means that TV would be the only difference, so you can't really say that anything else contributes to a difference. So this is known as a natural experiment because it's not artificially constructed. It's something that's naturally occurring. And if you're a researcher that's lucky enough to be aware of it and be there at the right time, well, then that's awesome. So in this study, they used made-up names for the community so that the community wouldn't be singled out in any way. And in community 1, that was called no-tel, meaning that they had no television at all. Community 2 was Unitel, meaning they had TV, but they only had access to one channel. And then Community 3 was called Multitel, meaning they had multiple TV channels. So before TV was introduced to Notel, the researchers took note of a whole bunch of different things. Reports on behavior from teachers, self-reports, language that the young people would typically use, actual physical aggressiveness, and a few others. And by all of these measures, aggressiveness with young people in the community was very, very low. So this gave the researchers like a baseline for their information. And then they went back 2 years after the introduction of TV and Notel, and sure enough, they found that aggressive behavior among young people had increased significantly. So from this study, we can conclude that yes, watching TV does have a negative effect on behavior. But again, the vast majority of research is focused on young children, or at least pre-adolescent children, not adolescents or older. And that's a problem because obviously an adolescent is not the same as a child developmentally speaking. They are more advanced cognitively, which means that an adolescent has a better understanding overall. They're more likely to have a better understanding of the difference between what's real or not, to understand what is okay in a given situation but not okay in another. But if you have an adolescent who already has particular characteristics that make them more prone to being aggressive or to being outright violent, will that make them more susceptible to imitating or copying being aggressive that they see on TV? Well, what we can say is that without a doubt, TV aggression and violence does not cause aggression and violence in real life. Because if it did, if the formula was as simple as that, then we would have a lot more violence in society because anybody who watched it would be affected that way. But even if we can't say causation definitely exists, there absolutely is some kind of correlation. We just still can't quite figure out exactly what it is because correlation also takes into account personal characteristics and the person's environment. So we're coming back to that example of the ice cream and the shark attacks. There's a correlation there, but correlation is not causation. What about video games? The belief that video games are problematic in the example they set for young people has existed since video games first emerged, especially in regard to young boys. But now more so for boys in later adolescence as well. The majority of adolescents in developed countries play video games at some point, and many play them regularly on a daily basis. And some video games are just games, mindless electronic games that don't require a great deal of thought, something to waste time on and keep your mind busy, something to zone out to. Please keep in mind you're listening to me. Who remembers when the first home gaming system came out? We had Atari and Space Invaders. We had Nintendo with the duck shooting game. In high school, we still had arcades in the mall. So the first home video systems had games that everybody agreed were pretty harmless. I mean, if you look at this and think of Space Invaders, it's, just shooting at little things on the screen that are obviously not meant to be real. But isn't that just the difference? As the games evolved over time, they began to involve not only more direct violence, but more lifelike violence. And that's what people tend to have a problem with. So now it can often seem like your character is a real person and you are really killing other people. Now, video games do everything they can to be as lifelike as possible. And over several decades, this has been studied extensively. And after those decades and decades and decades of studies, we still don't have an absolutely definite answer about the short-term or the long-term effects of playing violent video games, if any. Your text cites one study in particular in which college students participated as the subjects in two groups, one of which played a violent video game and one didn't. And then when they were tested, the group who did play the violent game were more aggressive. But the thing is, for every study you find that proves video games encourage aggressiveness, you'll find a study that proves they don't. There's no definitive answer. And it's kind of odd, isn't it, that it's considered a new approach to simply ask adolescents who like playing video games, why do you play them? Why do you play them so much? What do you like about them? What do you feel like you get out of them? When this approach is taken, they're pretty clear about why they like them and what they feel they get out of them. As mentioned in the text in one study of a group of 12 to 14-year-old boys, they said that it's like a fantasy experience. It's exciting, which comes back to the purposes of media being used for excitement, sensation seeking. They like the social aspects of the game, which I think adults forget about. Because for those of us who didn't grow up with them, we forget that you can play online with people in different locations. And if you're younger, you're probably laughing at me right now and thinking, yes, Jennifer, we've been able to do that for years. But we are used to thinking of playing video games as being a very solitary activity. And by we, I mean adults. And the boys in this study also said that the video games help them to cope, another general use of media. They said that playing the games has a cathartic effect, meaning that it helps them cope with their negative feelings. And they don't see any negative effect of playing the games at all. So there's a really, really, really wide variation with playing video games and how people respond to them. There is simply no exact answer, and there's so many outside variables that will have an effect. If somebody is already an aggressive person, they already have those tendencies. They are more likely to zero in on those qualities and what they watch and what they play. And because of that, they're more susceptible to being affected by those influences. By the way, it's the same with gender and media. If a girl is a really kind of girly girl, very feminine in her demeanor, really into makeup and clothes, that sort of thing, then when she watches TV or a movie, she's going to naturally zero in on those things that match what she already prefers. We tend to zero in on things that match what we already think, reinforcing what we already think. Now, again, how much of this is negative, or what can we say is negative? The very beginning of this chapter gives you the example of a movie called The Program that came out in '93. And in that movie, it's about a football team. At one part, the kids on the team lay down in the middle of the highway. I have a picture here because it's such a rush having the cars and trucks go by them so quickly when they're so close to the wheels. And your text points out that a few kids who saw the film decided to do this, and it had disastrous results. One was killed and one was permanently paralyzed. You can't say that seeing the movie made them do this, because if that was true, we would have had hundreds of people trying the same stunt, and that wasn't the case. So why didn't everybody, or even the vast majority of the people who saw the movie, do the same? Because they didn't have the same personal qualities, because they reacted differently, because they thought of the movie in a different way, because they were not seeking a thrill, because they didn't crave excitement in the same way. Yes, they were imitating the movie, but it was something about them as an individual that caused them to try it, probably a whole combination of factors. And that's why everybody didn't do it. And don't get me wrong, I mean, this is a horrible, horrible accident. I mean, and for the kids that this happened to and their parents, it's horrible. But you can't say that the movie made them do it. And it's the same with violent video games. We absolutely cannot identify a causal relationship, even though there is a correlation. Music has also been the subject of heavy criticism on and off over the years for having a negative influence on youth. In a previous class, I talked about how jazz was looked down upon in the 1920s. Remember, it was said to encourage sexual behavior because of the rhythm and because, women were wearing their skirts at knee length, God forbid. And the next time this occurred was with rock and roll. And even though these are the two kind of main examples we think of, we did have some stuff go on in the 80s. I remember very well in the 1980s when conservative groups wanted warning labels put on some heavy metal records. Notice I said records, not CDs. They didn't like the language in the lyrics. And this was quite a news grabbing social thing that took place in the 80s. And then something referred to as the Filthy 15 was released. So these are the top 15 songs recommended to be banned. Now, some of them, whether you think they should be banned or not, yes, the lyrics are suggestive. But for some of the other ones, I mean, Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It, we play that on the radio now. And I'm like, like middle-aged old people radio. Or Cyndi Lauper and She Bop. Or with Madonna and Dress You Up. But at the time, these were considered very, very controversial because they had such a negative influence on youth. Hip hop has also been criticized for having a substantial negative influence on young people, specifically in regard to sexual exploitation of women, violence, and drugs. When you look at criticisms regarding how women are portrayed in hip hop, specifically in hip hop videos and lyrics, there is quite a bit of, let's say evidence, maybe a better word would be example. There are quite a few examples of how women are referred to in a derogatory manner. Sorry, my dog was just about to start by barking. So when you look at criticisms regarding how women are portrayed in hip hop, it's all about the over sexualization of women, meaning that women are only portrayed from a sexual point of view and no other. Their only purpose is for sexuality, and their only sexual purpose is to serve the needs of men. And enmeshed with this is the suggestion that it's okay, that it's acceptable to treat them as nothing more than sexual objects that are only there for the enjoyment of men. Enmeshed with this is the suggestion that they deserve to be exploited and sometimes even sexually assaulted. This perception becomes much more intense when you consider some of the lyrics in hip hop music, and that it's very, very, very common for some artists to usually refer to women as bitches and hoes. And that a man asserting his dominance over a woman in this way is perfectly okay. Apart from sexualization of women and misogyny, another common thread in hip hop is violence. Lots of guns, lots of weapons, lots of gang references, and lots of violent confrontations. And the difference here, I want to make sure you get this, the difference here is that when it comes to violence in hip hop music, it isn't just done for effect in a video or for marketing purposes. Artists actually will do what they can to make it seem like when it comes to violence in hip hop music, that this is truly what their life is all about. That they come from a really rough neighborhood, that violence is a daily part of their life and they're proud of it, which just reinforces the violent themes overall as something that are positive, that have brought the artist fame and fortune and public recognition. And it's the same for the sexualization of women. The message is that these aren't just video vixens, that this is how they view women in real life. This is the role women truly play in their life. So again, the question is, what effect, either short or long term, does hip hop music have on adolescents? Well, we don't have a lot to say because there's not a lot of research about it. Now, you can look at various theories that already exist and apply them. Apply cultivation theory, apply learning theory. But in terms of actual research that would allow us to come to a conclusion, there really isn't much to look at. All we know is that for young people who already have a tendency towards aggressive or risky behavior, hip hop is popular. Yet again, correlation, not causation. If you think back to the uses of media for adolescents, absolutely hip hop music acts as a release of frustration for young urban youth. For those that do live in a rough neighborhood with a lot of violence and drugs, it helps them cope because they can identify with it. It helps them to verbalize their frustrations. And you might assume that the people who are opposed to this genre of music and what it portrays are all white, since the majority of hip hop artists are African American. But that's not so. The African American community at large has also criticized hip hop's reputation in these ways for reinforcing negative stereotypes about Black men and African Americans overall. That hip hop makes it seem like there's no differentiation in the population, and instead that the majority live and love a hip hop lifestyle with everything that goes along with it, which is completely false. So that their concern or their worry or their statement is that hip hop seems to imply that all African Americans celebrate street warfare and the gangster lifestyle, that they celebrate drugs, that all young Black men are angry and confrontational, that most African American men are dominating and view women to be used, and that most African Americans as a whole have accepted this way of life as a whole, which is completely false. So, just to summarize the effect of these different kinds of media, TV, video games, music, we just cannot make any absolute statements regarding what the effect of them is for all adolescents. We know there's a correlation, but there's other variables that will have an effect as well. And not acknowledging those variables would be really irresponsible. Now, as our last general topic, let's switch topics here and talk about advertising. Do you remember when cigarette ads in magazines were common? I do. Now, these ads are older than me. If you're old enough, you'll remember when smoking was thought of in a completely different way. For decades, cigarettes were advertised everywhere. And looking at some of the older ads for cigarettes, you might think they're made up, but they're not. Yes, in the 50s, doctors would sometimes be used to advertise cigarettes. And yes, they would even recommend particular brands for women to smoke when they were pregnant. Just odd, isn't it? And you would see ads for cigarettes everywhere. And you could buy cigarettes everywhere, including cigarette machines. So anybody of any age could put in a few dollars and get them out. And then you pull the little knob and the smokes would come out. You could send a 7 or 8-year-old to the store to get you a pack of smokes if you were a parent and you were out. Not only that, you would see people smoking everywhere. You would see people smoking a lot more in movies and on TV, and not just the tough guys. Everyone would smoke, and they'd smoke everywhere, not just in a bar. Even more recent movies. I just happened to rewatch the movie Gremlins a little while ago. And in it, this picture on the left with Gremlins, I couldn't find a picture of her with a cigarette in her hand, but she's in a bank there and she has a cigarette in her hand. She's not only smoking in the bank, she's smoking at the teller. So it wasn't just actual cigarette advertisements themselves. It was also having people regularly smoke in TV shows and movies. Now, something that was of special concern is that it was argued that cigarette companies were targeting young people on purpose to get them smoking when they were young, and then they'd be a lifelong smoker. Or would it be more accurate to say a lifelong customer, a lifelong consumer? So they would naturally do everything they could in their advertising and in making choices about product placement in movies to make smoking look really cool, to make it appeal to young people. And this might seem like a simple approach, and you might think that people, even adolescents, are too smart to fall for this ploy, but the fact is it's been very successful. And as your text points out, 90% of smokers begin smoking by age 18. And we're creatures of habits. We don't like change. So once somebody starts using one brand of something, no matter what it is, they're unlikely to change. And I include cigarettes in that. Not because we're necessarily loyal to one brand, although that's the word we use to describe this, customer loyalty. It's because you get used to one brand. We tend to stick with what we're used to. I have a strong preference for one brand of tomato soup. And God help my mother if I'm at her house and she has the other brand of tomato soup, not the one I'm used to. I have a preference for one brand of laundry detergent. Human beings are creatures of habit. Now, if you look at the old cigarette advertisements, they didn't feature middle-aged people sitting on their couch watching TV. They featured really good-looking people being active and enjoying life. Look at how happy I am. I'm smoking. Suggesting that if you smoke that brand of cigarette, you could be too. So this is why in the cigarette ads, people were really attractive, really cute. They always looked to be the epitome of health and either the ultimate masculine stereotype or hyper feminine and beautiful. And who is the number one example of this? Marlboro Man. He is the quintessential example of this. Really good looking, rugged, tanned, the epitome of masculinity that pretty much every woman would be attracted to and every man would want to be like. Whether you like smoking or not, the Marlboro Man is one of the most successful marketing characters ever produced. I remember that women as a whole always thought he was gorgeous and they'd make jokes about it. And by the way, it is true that two of the actors who played the Marlboro Man eventually died of cancer. And we know that research strongly indicated there was a link between advertising and adolescents smoking. And that the effect of the ads was stronger on adolescents than on adults, that adolescents were more susceptible to being influenced by advertising. Now, you got to remember though, this is what advertising is supposed to do. It is designed to encourage people to purchase the product being advertised, to make you aware of it as much as possible, and in doing so, encourage you to buy it. The more effective advertising is, the more sales go up. So the marketing strategists for the cigarette companies were doing what they were supposed to do. And just as a side note here, it was the same for ads for tanning oil in the 70s and 80s. Not sunscreen to protect you from the sun, tanning oil to get a tan that was as dark and deep as possible. You don't see those anymore either because we are now much more aware of what a lot of sun exposure can do to your skin. But these advertisements also showed young, healthy people having fun to suggest these are the kind of people that use tanning oil. So if you use Coppertone or Hawaiian Tropic or whatever it is, you can be just like them. Now it's interesting to note in your textbook when they point out that separate cigarettes were created to be marketed especially to women. Virginia Slims, Silva Slims, and Eve. Why did they create cigarettes just for women? Because the companies wanted to have a product they could market just to women, to increase their sales with women. So they did everything they could to market to women. And what I find especially interesting with the Virginia Slims ads is if you read the small print, they really connect smoking their cigarettes to being a strong, independent woman. So the one on the left with the girl in the yellow, it says, it took Marjorie Taylor 25 years to get up the courage to smoke in front of her husband. It took Mr. Taylor 25 seconds to pack up his wife's bags. So like when you're smoking our cigarettes, you're doing what women were never allowed to do in the past. And that shows you how far we've come. So cigarettes created and marketed specifically to women were thought to be more ladylike and to be a good idea. Because you know women are going to want to smoke more if you put flowers on the package, but that's what was thought. So absolutely, this is going to have an effect. Now, have cigarette companies ever come right out and admitted it's in their best interest to have as many people as possible who smoke and to have them start smoking as young as possible? Of course not. But as I said, that is the whole point of marketing a product, to maintain sales or to increase sales. If advertising didn't have this effect, there'd be no point. And we also know that during legal proceedings, as indicated in the text, documents came to light that stated, today's teenager is tomorrow's potential regular customer. The base of our business is the high school student. And realistically, if our company is to survive and prosper over the long term, we must get our share of the youth market. Now, if this was any other product other than cigarettes, people would say, yeah, that makes sense. But because it's cigarettes, it makes sense and we're offended by it. So if this was Coke or Pepsi, or Campbell's or Heinz tomato soup, or Gain or Tide laundry detergent, we wouldn't be so offended by these statements. But because they're in regards to cigarettes, of course we are. So it is absolutely recognized that the youth market is a market that you want to go after to make as much money as possible. Now, cigarette advertising has decreased significantly. It used to be on billboards, on the boards at a hockey arena, on ads on the sides of buses, everywhere you can think of. Now, you can't even have cigarettes for sale out in the open. They have to be covered. When I went to high school in the 80s, we had a smoking area at our school for students, not off school grounds. We had a designated area for us to smoke at the school right outside the door. Teachers were allowed to smoke in the staff room. When I first started school, started as a student at Nipissing in my undergrad in probably 1991, in the lecture rooms, the seats still had little ashtrays and the armrests. Half the cafeteria was for smoking at the university. You could smoke on planes. So overall, as a whole, our society's attitude towards smoking as a whole has completely shifted. And with it, the desire to prevent young people from starting to smoke in the first place as much as possible. Now, the concern regarding youth is e-cigarettes, or also known as vaping. An electronic cigarette is a battery-operated device, and it emits a vaporized solution to inhale. The solution does usually contain nicotine, and it's supposed to provide the person the same sensation of inhaling tobacco smoke, but without the smoke, or at least without, the smoke from like a regular cigarette. So an e-cigarette might be called an e-hookah, a vaporizer cigarette, a vape pen. When these first emerged, they were really looked at as a solution to smoking traditional cigarettes, especially the smoke, the smell, and the health risks. But they are classified as tobacco products. And vaping is really popular with teens. In fact, vaping is the most popular form of tobacco use among young people in the US, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And they do contain nicotine, they contain other toxins, they do produce secondhand smoke, and they are addictive, just like a traditional cigarette. And we are just beginning to understand the health risks of vaping. So at first, vaping was looked at as, well, this is something that's okay. It's not going to harm young people in the way that cigarettes do. But we're now beginning to recognize that it's not the silver lining that we thought. So, the effect of advertising on youth. Now, to wind up this discussion, let's focus on social media, because that's usually the first kind of media people think of when asked about adolescents and the media. Social media is truly used with every implication of the word used by adolescents and emerging adults in specific ways. To keep in touch with friends, to meet new people, to share thoughts and ideas, and everything you can possibly think of. Especially toward the end of adolescence, social media is really relied on to help you stay in touch with people when you move and start working and that sort of thing. And it is extremely, extremely, extremely influential for adolescents in terms of development. Is it harmful? Does social media really have a truly negative effect on adolescents and either stunt their development or warp it in some way? Well, some of the worries about social media apply to everybody, not just to young people. They worry that, um, or the worry is um, that we feel more connected because of social media, but that it actually disconnects people because they don't seek out in-person communication as much as we used to. But as common as this belief is, as much as parents worry about their teens spending too much time online and not enough time socializing in person, I fully admit this is one of the things I nag about. As indicated in the text, according to a national survey of American adolescents by Common Sense Media, social media has mostly positive effects on adolescents' lives. Now, as a side note, Common Sense Media is a great website for parents. What they do is they provide a really, really detailed assessment of movies, TV shows, and video games in terms of language and violence and sexuality. And they also let parents and kids make comments. So I don't know, it's The Avengers. It's the first movie that came to mind. You would type in The Avengers, whatever the first one is, and you can get a whole bunch of opinions from adults as well as from the kids who watch the movies. So I actually relied on Common Sense Media quite a bit when my son was growing up in terms of keeping track of exactly what he should or should not be watching. Anyways, what Common Sense Media has determined is that social media is largely positive for adolescents and emerging adults. It makes them feel more confident, and it actually helps them develop friendships because they can stay in touch with people easier. Either people they know in person that for whatever reason they don't see them very much, or people that live somewhere else, that go to a different school, that has a different schedule than them because of their job, so they don't see them very often. They feel like they know people better, and they can also find people that they are likely to have common interests in. So somebody who has difficulty making friends in person can have that need fulfilled online. And what this also does is create more of a common experience for adolescents around the world. It doesn't matter if you live in an urban area in the middle of Toronto or Vancouver, or in Nunavut on an island off the mainland, or anywhere else in the world, adolescents increasingly had the same exposure to different influences. This is the effect of globalization regarding digital media. Remember the picture earlier in this class with the tribesmen with their phones. Especially Western American media is popular and thus influential. And your text provides several examples of case studies, of ethnographies, of how the globalizing effect of media has affected different cultures. So let's pull this all together. I tend to say that at the end of every class, don't I? Usually when we think of young people in media, the first thing we think of is the internet. And that is part of it, but media has been around for decades, decades and decades and decades, well before the internet was ever a thought in somebody's mind. So you have to remember that it includes basic television, that it includes basic music, as well as advertisements and magazines and newspapers. And even if what used to be print media is now online and no longer actually on paper, that's still media. And it will have an influence on young people. I think what we need to remember is that we just cannot make any kind of definitive statements. A causes B, We just can't do it. There are too many variables that come into effect here. And the fact is that people seek out what they like because it's what they like. Why do I like the music I do? Because of my age, my personality, the experiences I have or haven't had, how I was raised, and it all contributes and has a domino effect. So when we look at the effect of media on young people, we just cannot say anything that's absolutely definitive. So as always, if you have any questions, just let me know, shoot me an email. Don't forget to do your quiz. And this is your last new chapter. Next one will be the review for the final exam.